So for today's lecture, I'm going to talk briefly about Brazilian soccer, introduce our book for today, Futebol, the Brazilian Way of Life, and finally I'll talk about the subject of the final chapter excerpted from the book and your reading for today, Socrates, the Brazilian soccer star who died very recently on December the 4th last year and was a legend in Brazil and beyond, both on and off the pitch. Finally, I will indicate briefly how I think Brazil has, and its soccer culture, have changed since the publication of Alex Belos's book, Futebol, the Brazilian Way of Life, in 2002. Let's begin with an anecdote to show the worldwide impact of Brazilian soccer. In 2002, during the last World Cup in South Africa, one of my colleagues here in modern languages, a French professor who's since retired, turned up at Kaufman Hall during the summer holidays in a Brazilian soccer shirt. I'm afraid that I rather teased him about this sartorial choice and claimed that it was much too easy to show up every 4 years in a Brazilian shirt rather than putting in the proper time as a fan, supporting the team in between tournaments. This strikes me now as a rather Nick Hornby-esque attitude, i.e. that followers of a team must go through the requisite suffering in order to call themselves proper fans. But on the other hand, who wouldn't want to be Brazil? A team that has won the World Cup 5 times, been runners-up twice, and is synonymous with samba soccer, playing freely with imagination, style and sheer joy. I've posted on our course homepage a link to some of the highlights from Brazil's 1970 World Cup campaign, which, as Nick Hornby points out in Fever Pitch, redefined the possibilities of the sport for his generation, and saying the Brazilians of 1970 were good at soccer is a little like saying Michelangelo could paint a bit, or Shakespeare, he wasn't a bad writer after all. Another anecdote will also illustrate the degree to which soccer looms large within Brazilian culture. During the 1998 World Cup, I was living in Brighton in Massachusetts, an area with a large Brazilian immigrant population. When Brazil lost the final to France, the local Brazilian community staged a kind of funereal motorcade, tooting mournfully on their horns and trailing the Brazilian national flag out of their windows so that it scraped along the surface of the road. At the time, I had a summer job teaching English as a foreign language, and on the day after this infamous loss, the Brazilian students in my class were constantly saying, "Of course I got that question wrong. I'm Brazilian and I'm a loser." What really drove them mad, though, was the fact that the French kids, whose team had won the World Cup, didn't seem to care about that at all. The Brazilians couldn't conceive of a world view in which soccer wasn't at the centre. As you read the excerpts from Alex Belos's excellent book Futebol, the Brazilian Way of Life, think about how Belos connects soccer to broader developments in Brazilian culture. In the chapter entitled Heroic Feat, Belos's main focus is race. As he points out, Brazil maintained slavery until the 1880s, so that's 20 years later than the Civil War here in the US, and had 3.5 million slaves, more than 6 times the number in the US, and a much higher incidence of interracial marriage. As Belos explains, soccer seems to have provided a means of expressing national identity in a country in which a large proportion of the population is of mixed ethnic heritage. In his chapter on Socrates, Belos turns to more contemporary politics, in particular the Brazilian star's role in the pro-democracy movement of the 1980s. Bear in mind that democracy only returned to Brazil fully in 1989, after an extended period of dictatorship that began in 1964. In the interview, Socrates not only discusses his political radicalism, but also his views on education, democracy, and the Brazilian way of life in general, in a way that most contemporary soccer stars, with their agents, handlers, sponsorship deals, and complete lack of articulacy, would be hard-pressed to emulate. Finally, I think it's worth noting how Brazil has progressed economically since 2002. It's now the 6th biggest economy in the world, and, perhaps more importantly for our purposes, it will be the host of the 2014 World Cup. In the world of football, this economic rise will mean that young Brazilian soccer stars will no longer have to look overseas to further their careers, and that the Brazilian clubs will actually be able to hold on to more of their abundant homegrown talent in the future. Thanks very much.